This program is brought to you in part by SalCal Real Estate Connections.
Welcome today as we have the privilege to spending a day with George Dragon, and believe me, we're here at his Westport showroom facility, and boy, let me tell you, you're in for a treat today as we're going to talk to George about some of his cars, and as you will find out, he is one of the most noted auto historians that I've ever met in my life, and believe me, you will definitely love what you see today, and I hope you give us some feedback about what you think about George and the show. Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Yes, finally, George, we get to talk to you at your facility here in Westport. And boy, from what I'm looking at here, you got some very interesting cars. Now tell me, how long have you been here at this facility?
Well, welcome, Larry. We've been here for about 6 years in Westport, but we've had our business going in Bridgeport for 37 years.
Wow, 37 years.
Yes, we've done restorations on hundreds of cars, sold thousands of cars all over the world.
So this facility here is mainly your showroom.
Yes, it is, just a showroom. We don't do any work here.
And you're noted for doing I'll tell you, your work is just right spot on. I just love what you do, George.
Well, thank you so much. We try to do the cars exactly how they looked back when they were new.
Now tell me something. This car next to us is kind of very interesting. 1898. I mean, that's going back a ways. Talk to me about this car, George.
Okay, so it's an 1898 Riker Electric Phaeton. It was one of the first cars that was built by Andrew Riker's Riker Electric Motor Vehicle Company in Elizabethport, New Jersey. He had started in business in Brooklyn in 1896 and moved to a larger facility in 1898. This car is in all original condition, and it's got a very interesting history. It did end up in the Henry Ford Museum in 1929, but it was Andrew Riker's personal car. This car has been to many events. As a matter of fact, there's a photo of it racing at Charles River Park in Boston, and when it was new in 1898. And one of the most outstanding places that it's been was he took it to the Paris Exposition in 1900. That was the Paris World's Fair, where he got a gold medal for having the finest electric car at the Paris Exposition. Most electric cars, or all electric cars at that time, were based on a 48-volt system. He juiced this one up to 72 volts. So in 1900, even though his car was 2 years old, it would go 40 miles an hour and 50 miles on a charge.
Wow, I'm impressed. In the 1800s, right?
Right, in 1900, actually the first car in the world to do a mile a minute was an electric car in France in 1899. So he was very aware of what was going on in the automotive world, especially in France. And he felt that this was the best car that he could bring to the World's Fair in 1900 in Paris.
I just can't get over the fact that when we go back in time that far, they had electric power, but gasoline really didn't become popular until later on.
Right. Steam was the main mode of power at the turn of the 20th century in 1900. Electric was next, and then gasoline.
Now tell me, this company, Riker, how long did they make cars? Were they around a while?
Well, he built cars from 1896 to 1901 when he sold his company to Colonel Pope of the Columbia Bicycle Company and the Pope Hartford fame in Hartford, Connecticut. And the reason he sold his company was, I have his diary, and I'll just tell you one of the little excerpts. When he was at the Paris Exposition, he was being presented a gold medal by the president of France for having the finest electric car at the show. And he looked over and he said he saw the Frenchmen driving by in their gasoline cars at 60 miles an hour while sipping champagne. So that was his epiphany moment. He knew that he thought this was as far as he could go with his electric. And he did view the car that did a mile a minute in 1899, this electric car, over in France. And he vowed when he got back to the U.S., he was going to build his own car, which was called the Riker Torpedo, that is now in the Henry Ford Museum. He built that car to have the first American car do a mile a minute. Unfortunately, someone beat him out before that. I think it was Alexander Winton with a gasoline car, but he still built the Riker Torpedo, and it's on display at the Henry Ford Museum.
Well, the history about this company and this car is special, I'll tell you. And I'm sure you don't see many of these cars.
No, there's only 6 Riker electrics in the world that exist, and 4 in museums, 1 here, and 1 still owned by the Riker family.
Yeah, it's really hard to understand. You know, our viewers had no idea what went on in the early beginnings of these automobiles and how electric played a big role.
Right. Oh, sure. For a while, they thought electric, especially Thomas Edison, who built the batteries, thought that electric cars were going to beat out any other mode of power. But the problem was, just like today with modern electrics, you could only go so far on a full charge of batteries. At that time, this car got up to 50 miles on a charge. Well, that was pretty much the extent of what, as far as you could go at the turn of the 20th century. Now, of course, later on, it was a little bit better, but not much better.
Yeah, it's really interesting to know. I mean, I just can't fathom in that time period. The cars like this were really the top of the technology.
Right, for electric cars, yes. He was this was as far as he thought he could go. And Colonel Pope actually, even though he built gasoline Columbias and the Pope Hartford, he really bet all his chips on the electric car. He was in control of something called the Electric Trust that started in 1901. And he wanted to control all the taxi cabs in the major cities in the United States, get rid of all the horse-drawn cabs, and have electric cabs. So that's something that you hardly ever read about, is that he had a controlling interest. And we talked about off camera earlier about the Selden patent. He became in control of the Selden patent, which was a patent that collected royalties for people that for companies that built cars in the United States.
Yeah, of course, we all know the sad history there, and who had beat Selden and Pope in the courts.
Right, it was Henry Ford, because Henry Ford refused to pay anyone royalties for building a car, because he thought it was was un-American to do that, because he knew that that there was lots of other people that worked on cars even before he did. Henry Ford built his first experimental car in 1896, but really the Duryea brothers in 1893 built the first gasoline production car up in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Yeah, if that case really went the other direction, Connecticut would have been Detroit.
That's a good point. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you, this car is certainly interesting, and I just can't get over the condition it's in, George.
Yes, it's all original condition, except with the exception of the patent leather fenders have been recovered, but the rest of it's all original. As a matter of fact, it still has A.L. Riker's initials, Andrew L. Riker's initials. This was his personal car. So it hasn't run since 1910, and he donated 5 Riker cars to Henry Ford when Henry Ford opened the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in 1929. So Henry Ford came here to Fairfield, Connecticut, Bridgeport, actually, to pick up these cars and ship them on his personal train car out to Dearborn to be added to the collection, and this was one of the cars. There are 3 Riker Electrics on display at the Ford Museum. This one hadn't been on display since probably the early 60s, so they deaccessioned it and sold it through an auction in 1985 when we purchased it.
Wow, you're lucky to have this car, I'll tell you.
Yes. Well, here's the thing about Riker also, is that now he gave up on electric cars when he after his seeing the gasoline cars in France, and when he came back, he built his. But then he sold out his company and all his electric patents to Colonel Pope in 1901 for $2 million. He took a year off, sailed around the world, had a yacht built, sailed around the world, and then came back, and he teamed up with the Locomobile Company of Bridgeport. Locomobile was a steam car company, Locomotive Automobile, which was that was the name shortened to Locomobile, when they switched to gasoline cars. And he designed their first gasoline car for Locomobile, which became later on probably the greatest car that was built in the United States at that time. As a matter of fact, their slogan was the best built car in America.
It's hard to believe the history here in Connecticut. I'll tell you, it's just special.
Right, absolutely. There is so much that people don't know about.
Well, we talked about this car, and I am so impressed. We could talk, I think, all day about this car if we really wanted to. But we're going to move on to one of my more favorite cars that I'm sure it holds a special spot in your heart. And we're going to get over and see what that's all about. Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Yes, I'll tell you, we're over to one of my favorite cars, George. And boy, I know you know a little bit about this car. You got to tell me how you acquired this 1907 Fiat race car. This got to be very interesting.
Well, yes, it is 1907 Fiat that raced at the Targa Florio in Sicily in 1907 and 1908. It was a factory team car. And actually, I did not find it. A friend of mine from Santa Barbara, California, found it by accident when he was looking for another car in Italy back in the 1970s. This car was raced in 1907 and 1908, and then what do you do with a used race car? It was sent back to the factory, and they made a street car out of it. They put fenders on it and a top, and sold it as a reconditioned car. And we've owned other cars like that. I had a 1909 Mercedes race car that was a 120 horsepower Grand Prix car that after a couple of years it was, obsolete. So what did the factory do? They sold it. They put a touring car body on it and sold it as a reconditioned car. So this car was used up to about 1915, and then it had some type of engine failure. Nobody knew at the time what it was, and it was pushed in a shed in 1915 and forgotten about. And it's not a bad thing because it was forgotten about and the engine didn't run, the engine locked up. They didn't use it for a tractor. It just became, something that was just forgotten about. It wasn't taken for the scrap drives during World War II. And the same family owned it right up until the 1970s. And a friend of ours had, as I mentioned, stumbled across it while looking for another car. And he found it in 1976 and took photos of it, wrote the Fiat factory, gave them the serial number, and because he had heard the story that it was one of the Targa Florio racers. Well, Fiat sent back a letter that in fact it was one of the 5 team cars. So he spent from 1976 till 1990 trying to acquire it. And in the late 70s, it was given to another member of the family, and the fellow was going to restore it someday. It was like a great-grandson, but he never got around to it. So my friend ended up buying it in 1990, shipped it back to the U.S. here, started the research, and then sent it to us here in Connecticut to do the restoration. Fortunately, he passed away in 1991, and we purchased a car from his estate. So then we had to start the research on it. So how do you do research on the car? I don't speak Italian, but I did have friends in Italy that told us how to go about it. There was these two women that ran the Fiat archives for many years, and if you sent them the information, that they would, I think at the time it was kind of expensive. It was either $6 or $7 an hour to, which is not expensive, to do the research. And they have these large books, ledgers, all handwritten. Wow. And they went line by line about, to get information about the car. We found out it was a factory team car. We don't know which car won the Targa Florio. A Fiat did win one of the team cars. It may have been this car, but we could never find out if this was the actual car. We did find out that Vincenzo Lancia did drive this car. Wow. And he was head of the Fiat racing team before he left and started his own company in 1908. So this car was totally unrestored. It was in very rusty condition, very poor condition, except the engine was all complete, including the racing carburetor and the dual spark magneto. Why this car became obsolete after just 2 races was that there was in Europe was a little bit different than here in the U.S. When there was no limit to how big the engines or how many horsepower. You had different classes, of course, but this is considered, this car, even though it's a 60 horsepower car, was considered, had 40 taxable horsepower at the time, so that's the class that it ran in, the team cars. But after that, they became 100 horsepower, then 150 horsepower, and by 1911, they were almost 200 horsepower. So these cars were huge. So this car was obsolete after a couple of years. So we started the restoration. Well, we started doing the research. It took us 10 years to really do a complete research. And while it was in our warehouse, we were trying to try to find photographs. And one thing, a big part of it is, even though the photos were in black and white, we kept finding different colors on this car. It had been painted a couple of times. But when we finally took it down to the frame rails, inside the frame, we found the red. Now, they did race in Europe, Fiats were red, and they raced here in the U.S. in the Vanderbilt Cup races and lots of other races, and they were black in the U.S. So we started the restoration just about 2005, and we finished it in 2009. And the first show we took it to was the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, and we won the race car class. And
wow.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise, because we were up against about a dozen great race cars from all eras. This was the earliest right up through some 50s Indy cars.
Can you imagine? I can't even imagine. I mean, that had to be, you were on cloud 9
Right.
there.
Oh, it was quite a thrill. We had always brought cars to Pebble Beach, starting way back in 1982, but this was the first time we won best in class for one of our own cars. We've won for our customers, but not our own car.
10 years researching the history.
Right, absolutely. And sometimes it doesn't always take that long, but it's with the internet today, you could do 10 years of research in probably 10 hours today. But we and unfortunately at the Fiat archives, those 2 old ladies are no longer there. It's almost impossible. There's no one working at the Fiat archives now to help with the history. You may have special permission to go in, but these women spent hours and hours at the time. They spent years. They would only spend, when I mentioned that it was $6 an hour, but they would only spend a few hours a week. And then sometimes when they would go for months, they wouldn't find anything about the car, and then they'd go through more of the books and then find more information. So today it's much easier to do, but none of that information that's in those ledgers or archives are online or anything. They're just sitting there. This is about early Fiat history.
Now tell me something. Do you talk with the Fiat company? Keep in contact with them about this car and other cars?
Not too often. No, the Fiat company is very big. They have they own Ferrari and the Fiat cars here now, Alfa Romeo, lots of other companies. So they have their own little private collection. There is another museum in Milan, the Biscaretti Museum, that has one of the other similar Fiat racers like this, but it's a little bit larger and it's a little newer than this one. But this, as far as we know, this is the only 1907 team car targa floor racer that exists.
Let me tell you, it's the first one I ever saw. I have to ask you one question. The engine in this car, basically, what is it like, the engine in this car?
Well, we could take a look at it. It's a T-head, four-cylinder T-head cast in pairs. And the T-head design means that the intake valves are on one side and exhaust valves are on the other. But it does have a racing carburetor, twin ignition, so it's got 8 spark plugs. But very simple, no battery. It's a hand crank start. Total loss oil system. It's double chain drive, so it's very simple. No seat belts. It went 100 miles an hour in 1907, and it certainly would do that today with ease.
Hard to believe, 100 miles an hour in this car. You had to be a free spirit.
Well, it was on dirt roads with lots of rocks, and yes, you had to have, definitely a lot of courage to drive a car like this.
Now, in this country, what kind of does this car have any kind of a history at all?
No, it did not. It did not. Fiat had a presence here and raced in the Vanderbilt Cup races on Long Island, starting in 1905, and then they moved to Savannah, and lots of great Fiat race cars were here in the U.S. As a matter of fact, they built some Fiats in the U.S. in Poughkeepsie, New York. They were built under license from 1910 to 1917. But this car did not have any racing history, only in Italy.
I can't imagine what it was like in Italy back then. It had to be unbelievable, huh?
Right. Oh, sure. There was a lot. Racing in Europe was a big thing. It was the number one sport. What other sports, were really going on? That was before soccer, before, lots of other sports there. So auto racing attracted. Well, I know here for a fact that the Vanderbilt Cup races, most of the races attracted 250,000 spectators along the race route, and even more than that in some cases.
I did read some history about it, and it's so interesting. I mean, you probably are looking at the start of the Long Island True Parkway system over there from that race.
Right. Willie K. Vanderbilt did believe in, and there is the Motor Parkway, which he had his own private road, which now it's still, the Motor Parkway is still there, but it was paved with concrete. And that was part of the race. The race track for the Vanderbilt Cup races was a circle of 52 miles, but most of it was on dirt roads.
Wow, let me tell you. Boy, I wish I had lived in that time frame just to see what went on, huh?
Right. Oh, sure. There was lots of activity. And just what was happening in the auto industry at that time, the leaps of technology, things that was before electric starters, before anything. All these cars were hand cranked. And some of them, this one, of all the guys, I think I'm one of the only ones that could crank it because it's very, there's lots of compression. There's no compression release on it. But some of these cars, you really had to have a lot of strength, not only to drive them, no power steering, or power brakes, but you had to be able to crank them. And then these were two-man cars, and they had a mechanic and a driver in all these races. And the mechanic's job was to keep oil in the car, pressurize the fuel system, but his main job was to help change tires, because along the race route, especially in Sicily there with all the rocks in the road, had a lot of cut tires. As a matter of fact, this car has 3 spares on it now. Most of the cars carried 4 spare tires during a race.
Wow. Boy, that'd be an interesting job. It's ironic that Fiat today that owns Ferrari and that the car is red.
That's true. Well, red, it's a typical Italian color. But yes, this is exactly what this car looked like in 1907. That's what the 10 years of research. Of course, there were no color photos, but we did find lots of detailed photos about the car, down to the shock absorbers, which were built under license from Peugeot. You would think a 1907 car would have shock absorbers, especially even on a race car. But there's no lights on this car. You know, it's a bare bones racer, no fenders. So the driver had to duck because, you know, he's going on dirt roads, and rocks were being thrown up from the tires also.
Yeah, this was a different era, I'll tell you. Well, let me tell you, this car is one of my favorite cars, George. And what your work on this car is just flawless.
Well, we did it not to sell. It was for a personal collection, so we wanted to make it as authentic as possible. That's where all the research. When you do a restoration, I don't care what car it is. It could be, you could be doing a Corvette, a Mustang today, or a Model A Ford. It's all in the research. If you want to restore it correctly, it takes time to. It gets down to nuts and bolts, as we say, when especially you know, on an early car like this. And it's you know, it is time consuming, but it's rewarding.
Rewarding in the end when you ended up with something like this. Let me tell you, it is special.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Well, we're going to move on to another time frame. And as usual, George, you always on your game when it comes to knowing what's going on, the history about this car.
Thank you very much.
Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. When you're having fun, time flies. Please tune in again for part 2 of this absolutely wonderful show.